I stared at the envelope in my trembling hands, the lawyer's elegant cursive spelling out my name, Eleanor Vance. Behind the polished mahogany desk, attorney Serena Chang sat with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between sympathy and satisfaction. My brother Jonathan's face had gone from confident smirk to ashen horror in the span of 30 seconds. Next to him, my mother Carol gripped the armrest of her leather chair so hard her knuckles turned white, while my father Robert simply stared at the floor as he always did when confronted with uncomfortable truths. The reading of Grandfather Arthur's will had just revealed what none of them saw coming. I, the family disappointment who had wasted her graphic design career to serve coffee, had inherited everything. The cafe, the commercial properties, the investment portfolio worth $6 million, and even the lake house they all thought had been sold years ago. Jonathan received exactly $1 and a handwritten letter that now lay crumpled in his fist. The room exploded with his rage, but all I could feel was the ghost of my grandfather's warm hand on my shoulder, and his final words to me 3 weeks ago: "They'll understand eventually, Eleanor. Or they won't. Either way, you'll be free." If you want to hear how a girl who was treated like the family servant became the sole heir to a fortune while exposing the darkest schemes of her own flesh and blood, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in my situation. Because this story, as wild as it sounds, is absolutely true, and it started 6 months before that moment in the lawyer's office. 6 months earlier, I was living what most people would consider a promising life in downtown Seattle. At 28, I had built a respectable career as a freelance graphic designer, working with tech startups and small businesses who appreciated my eye for clean, modern aesthetics. My studio apartment wasn't much, but it overlooked Pike Place Market, and I loved waking up to the sounds of vendors setting up their stalls at dawn. I had friends, a decent income, and the freedom to choose my projects. Then my phone rang on a Tuesday morning in April, and everything changed. Grandfather Arthur's voice came through, thin and tired, so different from the robust man who used to lift me onto his shoulders at the beach when I was 5. He explained that his last employee at Golden Dawn Cafe had quit without notice, and he was struggling to manage alone. The cafe had been his whole world since Grandma Ruth passed away 8 years ago, the place where they had built their dreams together, brick by brick, cup by cup. He didn't ask me outright to come help. He never would. He simply said, "I understand if you're too busy, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice." That sentence, heavy with unspoken need and a lifetime of unconditional love, made my decision for me. I told him I'd be there by the weekend. When I called my parents to let them know, my mother's response was immediate and sharp. "Eleanor, don't be ridiculous. You have a career to think about. Dad's been talking about selling that cafe for years. This is just him being stubborn again." I tried to explain that Grandfather needed help now, not a theoretical future solution, but she cut me off. "Your brother has important clients to manage. Robert is finally getting recognition at his firm. We can't just drop everything because Dad refuses to hire proper staff." The implication was clear: my work wasn't important enough to protect, but theirs was. I arrived at Golden Dawn Cafe on a gray Saturday morning, the kind of Seattle weather that makes everything look softer around the edges. The cafe sat on a corner lot in the Fremont neighborhood, its brick facade painted a warm cream color that seemed to glow even under overcast skies. Gold lettering on the window spelled out the name in an elegant script that Grandma Ruth had designed herself. She had been an artist among many other things, and her touch was everywhere in the hand. Painted tiles behind the counter and the carefully curated mix of vintage furniture and modern comfort in the way the morning light fell through the tall windows onto tables worn smooth by decades of conversations. Grandfather stood behind the espresso machine, his shoulders more stooped than I remembered his hands, shaking slightly as he steamed milk. At 82, he was still handsome in that weathered way that speaks of a life fully lived, deep lines around bright blue eyes, thick white hair that refused to lie flat, and a smile that could still light up a room. When he saw me walk through the door with my suitcase, his eyes filled with tears, he quickly blinked away. "You came," he said simply, and wrapped me in a hug that smelled of coffee beans and Old Spice, the scent of every childhood visit and holiday gathering. The first week was harder than I expected. I had worked retail during college, but running a cafe required a different kind of stamina. My feet ached from standing on the old tile floor, my back protested from bending over the dishwasher, and my hands cramped from wiping down tables and carrying heavy trays. But there was something deeply satisfying about the work, too. I learned the regulars' names and orders, discovered that Mrs. Sylvia always arrived at 7:15 for her cappuccino with extra foam that Agent Miller, a retired detective, liked his coffee black and strong while he read the morning paper that the Young Mothers Group gathered every Tuesday at 9, grateful for the kids' corner with toys that Grandma Ruth had set up years ago. Grandfather and I fell into a rhythm. He handled the baking rising before dawn to prepare his famous cinnamon rolls and blueberry muffins, while I managed the front taking orders and operating the espresso machine he taught me to use, with the care of a craftsman passing down sacred knowledge. During the slow afternoon hours, we would sit together at the corner table and he would tell me stories about building this place with Grandma Ruth. How they had scraped together their savings to buy the property in 1968, how Ruth had insisted on the gold lettering because she said every dawn was precious and deserved to be honored in gold, how they had survived recessions and neighborhood changes, and the invasion of corporate coffee chains by simply being themselves authentic, caring present. I put my design work on hold, telling my clients I was taking a family sabbatical. Most understood. A few didn't, and I lost them. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd get back to my career soon. But as weeks turned into months, something unexpected happened. I stopped minding. There was a peace in the cafe that my freelance life had lacked, a sense of purpose in making someone's morning better with a perfectly pulled espresso shot and a warm smile. I was exhausted every night, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that comes from honest work and genuine connection. My family's reaction, however, was less than supportive. My mother called weekly, each conversation a variation on the same theme. When are you coming home? You're wasting your talent. What about your future? My father said little as usual, but his silence felt like agreement. And then there was Jonathan. My brother had always been the golden child. 4 years older, he had followed the approved path, prestigious university law degree partnership at a downtown firm before 30. He was handsome in that sharp, expensive way that comes from good genes and better tailoring, with dark hair, always perfectly styled, and a smile that could charm clients and intimidate opponents in equal measure. Growing up, I had worshipped him. He was the big brother who protected me from bullies and helped me with homework. But somewhere in his 20s, something had shifted. Success had given him an edge, a hardness that turned his confidence into arrogance and his ambition into something colder. He rarely visited Grandfather Arthur, claiming his schedule was too demanding. But about 2 months into my time at the cafe, he started showing up always during busy lunch hours when he knew I'd be rushed. The first visit seemed innocent enough. He ordered a latte, complimented the foam art I had finally mastered, and asked casual questions about how Grandfather was managing. But the next time he brought a colleague, someone from his firm, and made a show of leaving a $20 tip on a $6 coffee, announcing loudly, "Keep the change, Eleanor. You've earned it." The emphasis on my name, the way he said it in front of his colleague, made something inside me cringe. I was a server to him now, not his sister. The third visit was when everything started to crack. It was a Friday afternoon, and the cafe was packed with the after-work crowd. I was juggling 6 orders, the espresso machine was acting temperamental, and I had a smear of chocolate syrup on my cheek from rushing to prepare a mocha. Jonathan walked in wearing a suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month, his phone pressed to his ear as he conducted some apparently crucial business call. He didn't acknowledge me, just held up one finger in a wait gesture as he finished his conversation. When he finally approached the counter, he pulled out his wallet with exaggerated slowness, extracted $3 bills and a handful of coins, and dropped them onto the tip tray with a clink that seemed to echo in the sudden lull of cafe. "Noise. Here you go," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescension that only family can truly perfect. "Tips for the help. You're doing great, by the way." Very authentic barista energy. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that only I could hear. "Mom's worried, you know. She thinks you've given up on having a real future. But hey, someone has to take care of the old man, right? Might as well be you since you don't have anything better going on." I felt my face flush hot, a mix of shame and rage that made my hands tremble as I reached for the coins. Around us, a few customers had noticed the exchange, their eyes flicking between us with that uncomfortable awareness of witnessing something they shouldn't. "Mrs." Sylvia, sitting at her usual table, frowned deeply. Agent Miller looked up from his newspaper with an expression I couldn't quite read. And Grandfather, emerging from the kitchen with a fresh tray of pastries, stopped in his tracks when he saw Jonathan. "Bradley," Grandfather said, using my brother's middle name the way he always did, a remnant from when Jonathan Bradley Vance was a child and his grandmother insisted on the full name. "What brings you by?" Jonathan's smile transformed instantly into something warmer, more genuine looking, the kind of smile he probably used on juries. Just checking in on my favorite people, Gramps. Making sure Eleanor isn't working too hard. He glanced at his expensive watch, a Rolex that he had definitely made sure everyone noticed. Though I have to run. Bye, client dinner tonight. You know how it is. He didn't wait for a response, just gave a little salute and walked out, leaving me standing there with 3 crumpled dollars and 47 cents in loose change in my palm. That night, after we closed, Grandfather made us tea and we sat in the kitchen area while rain pattered against the windows. He didn't mention Jonathan's visit directly, but he talked about family, about how people sometimes lose their way, when they chase the wrong things, about how his own brother had become a stranger to him decades ago, over an inheritance dispute. Money, he said softly, stirring honey into his chamomile tea, has a way of showing you who people really are. Your grandmother used to say that wealth is a magnifying glass. It doesn't change people. It just makes what's already there bigger and impossible to ignore. I should have paid more attention to that conversation. I should have seen the warning in his words. But I was tired and hurt and too focused on my own feelings of inadequacy to recognize that Grandfather was trying to prepare me for something. The next few weeks brought a subtle shift in the family dynamics that I didn't initially understand. Jonathan started visiting more frequently, but now he came during quieter hours, usually mid-morning after the breakfast rush. He'd order coffee and sit at the counter, making conversation with Grandfather about seemingly innocuous topics, the neighborhood changing, property values going up, how much work it must be to maintain an old building. He asked questions about finances, about whether Grandfather had considered updating the cafe's systems, about retirement planning. He was smooth about it, framing everything in concern, but there was something calculating in the way he listened to the answers, the way he took mental notes of every detail Grandfather shared. My parents started calling more often too, always wanting to know how Grandfather was doing, whether he seemed tired or confused, whether he was managing the business properly. My mother in particular seemed obsessed with the idea that he was declining. Eleanor, you need to watch him carefully. At his age, mental clarity can slip so quickly. Does he remember to pay bills? Does he get confused about orders? I kept assuring her that Grandfather was fine, sharp as ever, but she persisted with a concern that felt less like love and more like surveillance. Then came the family dinner in late June, 3 months after I had moved in above the cafe to help Grandfather more efficiently. It was supposedly a casual Sunday gathering, but my mother set the table with her best china, the Wedgwood set that only came out for important occasions. Jonathan arrived with a leather portfolio, which should have been my first clue that this was anything but casual. We ate my mother's pot roast while making strained small talk about the weather and Jonathan's recent case victories. Grandfather seemed quiet, withdrawn in a way that worried me. He barely touched his food. It was over dessert, my carefully prepared lasagna that I had brought, knowing it was Grandfather's favorite, that Jonathan finally revealed the real agenda. He set down his fork with deliberate precision, pulled out his portfolio, and began what I later recognized as a prepared presentation. I've been doing some research, he announced, his lawyer voice fully activated, about options for Dad's future. Financial planning, healthcare considerations, quality of life improvements. He spread papers across the table like evidence at a trial property, appraisals for the cafe building, brochures for luxury senior living communities, spreadsheets showing projected income from selling the business versus maintaining it. The numbers were impressive, I had to admit. According to his research, the Golden Dawn Cafe property alone was worth at least $2 million, possibly more given the neighborhood's rapid gentrification. There were multiple offers from developers, from chain restaurants wanting the location, from corporate coffee companies who saw the corner lot as prime real estate. The cafe, Jonathan continued, his tone reasonable and measured, is a money pit. It barely breaks even most months. Dad's working himself to exhaustion for what? Nostalgia. Meanwhile, he's sitting on a gold mine and refusing to cash in. If we sell, he could live comfortably for the rest of his life. Hell, we all could benefit from making a smart decision here. He looked at Grandfather with what I'm sure he thought was a caring expression. Dad, you've worked hard enough. You've earned the right to rest. Let us take care of you. The words, "let us take care of you," hung in the air like a threat disguised as affection. I felt my stomach turn, but before I could speak, my mother jumped in. Jonathan's right, Dad. You're 82 years old. What happens if you fall? If you get sick? Eleanor's doing her best, but she's not a medical professional. A proper facility would have nurses, activities, people your own age. You'd be safer. And richer, I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. Let's not pretend this is about safety. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. This is exactly the kind of emotional thinking that's keeping Dad trapped in that cafe. Eleanor, you don't understand business. You don't understand finance. You're a graphic designer who's playing barista. The adults are trying to have a real conversation about real issues. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. That cafe is his home. It's where he and Grandma built their life together. It's his history, his heart. You can't put a price tag on that, Jonathan. Actually, Jonathan said, pulling out another document I can. 2.3 million to be precise. That's what Harborview Properties offered last month. Dad turned them down without even consulting the family. He looked at our parents, without consulting anyone who has a stake in his well-being. Grandfather finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. Because it's my property and my decision. But is it, Dad? Jonathan leaned forward, his expression shifting to something that might have been genuine concern if I didn't know him so well. Are you really capable of making major financial decisions anymore? You're exhausted. You're losing weight. Eleanor mentioned you've been more forgetful lately. I froze. I had mentioned in passing during a phone call with my mother that Grandfather sometimes got confused about dates or repeated himself occasionally. Normal things for someone his age. But the way Jonathan weaponized that information, twisted it into evidence of incompetence, made me realize I had been feeding them ammunition without knowing there was a war brewing. I never said he was incompetent, I protested. I said he was tired. There's a difference. Is there? My mother's voice was sharp. Eleanor, you're too close to this. You've convinced yourself that him hanging on to that cafe is noble, but it's selfish. He's being selfish by refusing to let go, and you're enabling him because it gives you purpose. What happens when he's gone? You'll have wasted years of your life, and for what? The conversation devolved from there. Grandfather refused to discuss selling, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew so well. Jonathan grew more aggressive, citing legal precedents about fiduciary responsibility and elder care standards. My father, as always, said nothing, just stared at his plate while the battle raged around him. And my mother played her usual role, the practical one, the voice of reason, the one who claimed to be thinking of everyone's best interests while clearly prioritizing her own. We left that dinner in cold silence. In the car ride back to the cafe, Grandfather stared out the window at the passing streetlights, his reflection ghostly in the glass. I'm sorry you had to see that, he finally said. I knew it was coming eventually. I just hoped I was wrong about them. What do you mean? I asked, though a part of me already knew. He turned to look at me, and in the dim light of the car, he suddenly looked very old and very tired. Your grandmother once told me that you can judge people's character by what they do when they think an inheritance is at stake. She said it reveals the truth beneath all the pleasantries and pretenses. He reached over and patted my hand. You've passed that test, Eleanor. You came here because I needed help, not because you thought there was something to gain. The others, well, they're showing me exactly who they are. A week after that disastrous dinner, Grandfather collapsed while opening the cafe. I was still upstairs in my small apartment above the shop when I heard the crash. I ran down to find him on the floor behind the counter, clutching his chest, his face gray with pain. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes felt like hours as I held his hand and begged him to stay with me. Mrs. Sylvia, who had just arrived for her morning coffee, stood by the door, refusing entry to other customers and calling my parents. Agent Miller helped me lock up the cafe before riding with us to the hospital. The diagnosis was a mild heart attack, serious enough to require hospitalization, but not immediately life-threatening. The doctors said it was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. But the hospital room quickly became a battlefield. My mother and Jonathan arrived within an hour, and suddenly every decision required their input, their approval. They questioned the doctors about Grandfather's cognitive function, his ability to make medical decisions, his capacity to manage his affairs. They pushed for tests that went beyond his cardiac health, psychiatric evaluations, and cognitive assessments that seemed designed to build a case rather than ensure his well-being. Grandfather understood exactly what was happening. From his hospital bed, looking small and vulnerable in a way that broke my heart, he squeezed my hand and asked the question that would change everything. Eleanor, what do you think I should do? The room went silent. Jonathan and my parents stared at me, clearly expecting me to defer to their judgment as I always had. But I looked at Grandfather at the fear in his eyes, not fear of dying, but fear of losing control of his own life, and I knew I couldn't betray him. I think you should do whatever makes you happiest, I said clearly. If the cafe brings you joy, if being there gives your life meaning, then that's what matters. We'll make it work. We'll get help. We'll adjust. But you shouldn't give up the thing you love just because other people think it's inconvenient." Jonathan's face darkened. He grabbed my arm and pulled me into the hallway with more force than necessary. In the sterile corridor with nurses passing and machines beeping, he showed me who he really was. "You're making a huge mistake," he hissed. "You think you're being noble, but you're just being stupid. That cafe is killing him. He needs professional care, and instead you're feeding his delusions so you can feel important. You're not a caretaker, Eleanor. You're an enabler." "And you're a vulture," I shot back, surprising myself with the venom in my voice. "This isn't about what's best for grandfather. This is about that $2 million property you want to sell. You've already spent the money in your head, haven't you? Calculated your share, planned what you'll buy, how it'll boost your lifestyle. You're not worried about his health. You're worried about your inheritance." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I'm a lawyer, Eleanor. I know exactly how to protect Dad's interests, even if that means protecting him from you. If you don't step aside and let the adults handle this, I will pursue legal guardianship. I will prove he's not competent to make his own decisions. And when I do, you'll be out on your ass with nothing to show for your little cafe adventure except wasted time and destroyed career prospects." I should have been intimidated. The old Eleanor would have been. But something in me had shifted during those months at the cafe, learning resilience from the daily grind, drawing strength from grandfather's quiet dignity, seeing real kindness in customers like Mrs. Sylvia and Agent Miller. I met Jonathan's eyes without flinching. "Try it. But you should know that people who actually love him will fight you every step of the way." That night, after Jonathan and my parents left with threats and ultimatums hanging in the air, grandfather asked me to come close to his hospital bed. The monitors beeped steadily his IV-dripped medication, and through the window I could see the Seattle skyline lit up against the dark sky. He took my hand in both of his, and his grip was stronger than I expected. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. Something I've kept secret for a very long time." He paused, making sure we were alone. "Your grandmother and I were never poor. We lived simply because we chose to, because we believed in building something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth. But Ruth was brilliant with investments. She studied the market, made careful choices, and over our 50 years together, she built a portfolio that's worth, well, considerably more than that cafe building." I stared at him, not understanding. "What do you mean?" He smiled sadly. "I mean that the cafe is just one small piece of what I own. There are commercial properties in 3 states, rental income from buildings Ruth purchased decades ago when they were cheap stocks and bonds and mutual funds that have been growing for half a century. The cafe barely matters financially. I keep it because it's where I feel close to Ruth, where I can honor what we built together. But financially, Eleanor, I'm worth somewhere around $6 million. The number didn't feel real. It hung in the air between us like a foreign language I was still learning to speak. 6 millions. But you live so simply. The cafe barely covers expenses. You always said—" "I said money changes people," he interrupted gently. "And I was right. Look at your brother. He doesn't even know about the money yet, and he's already circling like a shark who smells blood. Imagine what he'd be like if he knew the real numbers." He squeezed my hand tighter. "I kept the secret because I wanted to see who would love me for me, not for what I could give them. You passed that test, sweetheart. You came when I needed help, worked yourself exhausted, defended me against your own family, all without any expectation of reward. That's who you are." Tears streamed down my face. "Grandfather, I don't care about the money. I care about you." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm telling you. Because I'm going to change my will, Eleanor. I'm going to make sure that what Ruth and I built goes to someone who understands its real value. But first, we need to protect ourselves. Your brother's threat about guardianship isn't empty. He'll try, and we need to be ready." The next morning, grandfather made 2 phone calls from his hospital bed. The first was to attorney Serena Chang, a specialist in elder law who had a reputation for defending seniors against financial exploitation. The second was to Agent Miller, who arrived at the hospital within an hour, his retired detective instincts clearly engaged by grandfather's request for help. What followed was 3 weeks of careful preparation that felt like planning for war. Attorney Chang was a sharp woman in her 50s with steel gray hair cut in a precise bob and eyes that missed nothing. She listened to grandfather's story, reviewed his medical records, and immediately recognized what was happening. "This is textbook elder financial abuse," she said bluntly. Your family is attempting to control your assets by questioning your competency. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon, but we can fight it. She helped grandfather draft a new will, one that clearly stated his wishes and his reasons. She arranged for independent psychiatric and cognitive evaluations from doctors who had no connection to my family. She compiled evidence of grandfather's continued mental acuity, his management of cafe finances, his coherent medical decisions, his clear understanding of his assets and wishes, and she prepared for the legal battle she knew was coming. Agent Miller took a different approach. With grandfather's permission, he began quietly documenting Jonathan's behavior. He sat in the cafe during Jonathan's visits, noting questions and comments that revealed motives. He spoke to neighbors who had witnessed my brother's increasing interest in the property. He even contacted the developer who had made the $2 million offer and confirmed that Jonathan had been the one to initiate that conversation, not the other way around. Meanwhile, I kept the cafe running, visiting grandfather every day after closing and trying not to fall apart under the pressure. My parents called repeatedly, demanding I stop poisoning Dad against his family and face reality about his declining health. Jonathan sent threatening emails about legal action. I felt isolated, exhausted, terrified that I had made everything worse by standing up for grandfather. But Mrs. Sylvia rallied the regular customers, organizing a rotating schedule of people who would help at the cafe so I could have breaks. Agent Miller brought me coffee and words of encouragement. And Attorney Chang reminded me that doing the right thing is rarely easy, but it's always worth it. The attack came exactly when Attorney Chang predicted it would. 2 representatives from Adult Protective Services arrived at the cafe on a Wednesday morning, accompanied by a doctor and a social worker. They had received a report, they explained, expressing concern about Arthur Morrison's mental capacity and ability to care for himself. The report claimed he was being unduly influenced by a family member, namely me, and that immediate evaluation was necessary to ensure his safety. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. This was Jonathan's move, the legal maneuver he had threatened. But grandfather, warned by Attorney Chang that this might happen, was remarkably calm. He invited the APS representatives to sit down, offered them coffee, and proceeded to demonstrate exactly how competent he was. For the next hour, he answered their questions with precision and clarity. He discussed his medical conditions and treatments in detail, showing understanding of his medications and doctor's instructions. He explained the cafe's financial situation, pulling out organized records of income, expenses, and tax payments. He described his daily routines, his social connections, his support system. He talked about his investment portfolio, surprising the representatives with his detailed knowledge of market conditions and strategic asset allocation. Then he turned the tables. "May I ask," he said pleasantly, "who filed this report? Because I'd like to understand their concerns. My family, perhaps. My son Jonathan, who has been pressuring me to sell my business so he can inherit sooner rather than later. Did he mention that he's already been in contact with developers without my knowledge or consent? Did he mention that he's suggested I lack capacity to make my own decisions simply because I won't do what benefits him financially?" The doctor shifted uncomfortably. The social worker made notes. Agent Miller, sitting at his usual table, and clearly there deliberately spoke up. "I'm James Miller, retired Seattle PD. I've been a regular customer here for 15 years. I've observed Mr. Morrison's mental acuity consistently, and I've also observed his son's recent behavior, which strikes me as more concerning than anything Mr. Morrison has done. In my experience, people who truly care about an elder's well-being don't start by trying to control their assets." The APS visit ended with no action taken. Their report concluded that Arthur Morrison was fully competent, engaged in his community, and making sound decisions about his life and property. But it also noted the concerning pattern of family pressure and recommended that Mr. Morrison consider legal protections against financial exploitation. Jonathan was furious. I learned this from my mother's phone call that evening, a stream of accusations and recriminations that I finally interrupted. "Mom, he tried to have grandfather declared incompetent so he could take control of his money. Do you understand that? Your son tried to steal from your father. He's trying to protect him," she shouted back. "And you've turned Dad against his own family. We raised you better than this, Eleanor. We taught you to respect your elders, and instead you're helping Dad make terrible decisions that will hurt everyone." "No," I said, surprised by how steady my voice was. "You taught me to respect people who deserve respect. You taught me to stand up for what's right. You just didn't expect me to use those lessons against you." I hung up before she could respond. It felt like cutting a cord that had been strangling me for years. The competency hearing happened 3 weeks later in family court. Jonathan had petitioned for guardianship, claiming grandfather was no longer capable of managing his affairs and needed court-appointed oversight. It was a desperate move, Attorney Chang explained, but a dangerous one. If Jonathan succeeded, grandfather would lose control of his own life, his property, his decisions. Everything would be subject to court approval, with Jonathan likely appointed as guardian. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled and formal, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Jonathan sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a sleek man in an expensive suit who looked like he specialized in winning ugly cases. My parents sat behind them, my mother rigid with determination, my father slumped with resignation. On our side, grandfather sat between Attorney Chang and me, wearing his best suit, the navy one he had married Grandma Ruth in decades ago. Jonathan's lawyer presented his case first, a portrait of a declining old man being manipulated by a granddaughter who had isolated him from family, encouraged him to reject reasonable offers for his property, and poisoned him against relatives who only wanted his welfare. They had a psychiatrist who had evaluated grandfather once briefly and found indicators of diminished capacity and possible undue influence. They had financial records showing the cafe's minimal profitability, suggesting poor business judgment. They had my parents' testimony about changes in grandfather's behavior, his forgetfulness, his stubbornness. It was convincing, I had to admit. If I didn't know the truth, I might have believed it. Then Attorney Chang stood up, and I understood why she had the reputation she did. She was methodical, precise, and devastating. She called grandfather's primary care physician, who testified that Arthur Morrison was in excellent mental health for his age, with no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. She presented the independent psychiatric evaluations, showing full competency. She introduced financial records, proving that grandfather's investment portfolio had been carefully managed for decades, with returns that would make most financial advisors jealous. Then she called Agent Miller to the stand. He testified about the pattern of Jonathan's visits, the increasingly pointed questions about property values and inheritance, the conversations with developers that happened before any concern for grandfather's health was expressed. In my 30 years as a detective, he said, looking directly at Jonathan, I learned to recognize when someone is motivated by concern versus when they're motivated by greed. Everything, Mr. Jonathan Vance has done fits the pattern of financial exploitation, not family care. Mrs. Sylvia testified next, describing grandfather's daily competence, his relationships with customers, his clear understanding of his business and his life. She also, without prompting, mentioned the times Jonathan had visited the cafe, including the incident with the coins and his dismissive treatment of me. A man who truly respected his father, she said firmly, wouldn't humiliate his sister in their father's place of business. That showed me what kind of character we're dealing with. But it was grandfather's testimony that sealed it. Attorney Chang helped him onto the stand, and for 45 minutes he was magnificent. He spoke clearly about his life, his marriage, his business philosophy. He explained his decision to live simply, despite having means his choice to keep the cafe as a memorial to his wife and a contribution to his community. He described his relationship with each family member, including the painful truth about Jonathan's growing distance and sudden interest once property values rose. I don't question my son's intelligence, he said, his voice strong despite his age. I question his priorities. He sees my life's work as a real estate opportunity. He sees my home as a liquidity problem. He sees his father as an obstacle to his inheritance. He paused, looking directly at Jonathan. I've managed my affairs for 82 years. The only thing that's changed is that certain family members have realized I might leave my money to someone who actually loves me rather than someone who sees me as a retirement plan. The judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, listened to everything with an expression that gave nothing away. When the testimonies concluded, she took less than 10 minutes to deliberate. Her ruling was swift and decisive. Arthur Morrison was fully competent to make his own decisions. The petition for guardianship was denied. Furthermore, she noted for the record that the pattern of behavior described suggested possible elder financial abuse, and she was recommending the case be reviewed by the appropriate authorities. Jonathan's face went white, then red. My mother looked like she had been slapped, and my father, for the first time in my memory, looked ashamed. Outside the courthouse, Jonathan tried to confront grandfather, but Attorney Chang stepped between them smoothly. Mr. Vance, any further contact with my client should go through my office. I believe we're done here. As we walked to the car, I could hear Jonathan behind us arguing with his lawyer, his voice rising with barely controlled fury. Grandfather was quiet on the drive home. When we got back to the cafe, he asked me to sit with him in the empty dining room, the late afternoon sun slanting through the windows and turning everything golden. "I'm tired, Eleanor," he said softly. "Not mentally tired. Just tired of fighting people I once loved. Tired of seeing what greed does to family." "I know," I said, holding his hand. "But we won. They can't hurt you now." He smiled sadly. "Did we win? Or did we just survive? There's a difference." He looked around the cafe at the tables where Grandma Ruth had served thousands of customers at the counter where they had stood side by side for decades, at the photographs on the walls documenting a lifetime of love and community. "Promise me something, Eleanor. Promise that when I'm gone, you'll remember what this place really meant. Not the property value, not the profit margin. The connections. The purpose. The way Ruth and I tried to make a little corner of the world warmer and kinder." "I promise," I whispered. 3 weeks later, on a quiet September morning, Grandfather Arthur passed away in his sleep. He was in his own bed in the apartment above the cafe, surrounded by photographs of Grandma Ruth and memories of their life together. I found him when I came down to open the cafe, still and peaceful, a slight smile on his face, as if he had dreamed something beautiful in those final moments. The grief was overwhelming, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. But mixed with the sorrow was gratitude that he had died free in his own space, master of his own life, until the very end. The funeral was small, the way he had wanted it. Mrs. Sylvia came, and Agent Miller, and dozens of customers who had been touched by his kindness over the years. My parents came, subdued and uncomfortable. Jonathan came separately, standing at the back of the church, his face unreadable. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following week. Attorney Chang called all the family members to her office, a sleek space in a downtown high-rise with a view of Elliott Bay. I arrived early, my stomach in knots, not knowing what to expect. My parents came together, my mother in severe black, my father looking older than I remembered. Jonathan arrived last, his lawyer in tow, clearly expecting a fight. Attorney Chang wasted no time. She distributed copies of the will, then began reading in her clear professional voice. The cafe building and business went to me. 2 commercial properties in Portland went to me. A rental complex in Spokane went to me. The investment portfolio, carefully managed, and now worth approximately $6 million, went into a trust with me as primary beneficiary. The lake house that everyone thought had been sold years ago was also mine. In total, I was inheriting an estate worth roughly $8.5 million. My parents received $50,000 each, enough to be comfortable, but nowhere near what they had expected. The will noted that they had been provided for during their lives and had chosen their priorities. Jonathan received exactly $1. And a letter. The room erupted. Jonathan lunged forward, grabbing the will from the table, his face contorted with rage. "This is fraud. She manipulated him. She isolated him from his family and poisoned his mind." He turned on me with such fury that Agent Miller, who had been invited as a witness, actually stepped between us. "You conniving bitch! You pretended to care about him so you could steal everything." Attorney Chang's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "Mr. Vance, I'd strongly suggest you sit down and control yourself. This will was prepared with full legal oversight, with independent psychiatric evaluations, confirming your father's competency, and with extensive documentation of his reasoning. If you contest it, you will lose. Moreover, you'll drain whatever you might receive in legal fees." "Whatever I might receive," Jonathan's laugh was ugly. "I got $1. $1 goddamn dollar from my own father." "You got exactly what you earned," Attorney Chang said coldly. She pulled out a file thick with documents. "Your father documented every conversation, every pressure tactic, every attempt to control his assets. He recorded phone calls where you discussed selling his property without his consent. He saved emails where you researched guardianship laws. He had witnesses to your treatment of your sister in his place of business. Would you like me to continue?" Jonathan's lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear. Jonathan shook him off violently. "There's more," Attorney Chang continued, directing her attention to me now. "Your grandfather established a separate trust of $1 million specifically for legal defense. Eleanor, you are not to spare any expense defending this inheritance from family members who believe they deserve what they never earned. He wanted you protected." She handed me a sealed envelope. "He left this for you. Private. My hands shook as I opened it. Grandfather's handwriting, shaky but clear, filled 2 pages. I'll spare you most of it, the personal memories and private words between a grandfather and the granddaughter he loved. But the end is burned into my memory. Eleanor, by the time you read this, I'll be with Ruth again, and I hope I'll be at peace. I leave you everything, not because you're perfect, but because you loved me when loving me was inconvenient. You sacrificed your career, your comfort, and eventually your family relationships to ensure my final years were lived on my terms. You asked for nothing and gave everything. That's who you are, and I'm so proud of you. Your brother will be angry. Your parents will be disappointed. They'll say terrible things about you, about me, about the decisions documented in this will. Let them. You don't need their approval anymore. You have something far more valuable. You have integrity, compassion, and the knowledge that you did the right thing even when it was hard. Use this inheritance wisely. Not just the money, though. I trust you to be a good steward of what Ruth and I built. Use the lesson. Use the strength you've discovered. Build something meaningful. Help others the way you helped me. And remember that the best revenge against people who only value money is to live a life rich in all the ways that actually matter. I love you, my dear girl. Take care of our cafe. Take care of yourself. And know that your grandmother and I will always be proud of you. You were the dawn after our longest night, our golden dawn. I was crying by the time I finished, tears dripping onto the paper and smudging the ink. When I looked up, Jonathan was staring at me with such hatred that it was almost physical. You'll regret this, he said quietly. I'll make sure of it. I'll contest this will. I'll tie you up in court for years. By the time I'm done, there won't be anything left worth having. But Attorney Chang smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. Actually, Mr. Vance, let me share something else your father prepared. She pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Jonathan's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable from one of his visits to the cafe. The recording captured him pressuring grandfather to sell, dismissing his wishes, calculating property values, and making thinly veiled threats about competency proceedings. There were multiple recordings, timestamps carefully noted, each one more damning than the last. Your father, Attorney Chang said, stopping the playback, believed in being thorough. These recordings, along with witness statements and documented evidence of financial exploitation attempts, form a comprehensive case that will not only defeat any will contest, but could potentially result in criminal charges for elder abuse. Do you really want to pursue this, Mr. Vance? Jonathan's lawyer was already packing his briefcase, clearly wanting no part of this disaster. My brother stood frozen, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his rage. My mother spoke for the first time. Jonathan, stop. Just stop. Her voice was hollow, defeated. We've lost. Can't you see that? They left separately, my parents first walking out like mourners at their own funeral. Jonathan stayed a moment longer, his eyes burning into mine. This isn't over, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew it was over. We all did. After they were gone, I sat in Attorney Chang's office, surrounded by legal documents that proved I was now wealthy beyond anything I had ever imagined, and I felt empty, not triumphant, not vindicated, just sad for what we had all lost long before grandfather died. Sad for the family that could have been if love had mattered more than money. Agent Miller drove me back to the cafe. It was late afternoon, the time when the after-work crowd usually started filtering in. But the cafe had been closed for a week, and the windows were dark. He walked me to the door, then surprised me by pulling me into a brief fatherly hug. Your grandfather was a good man, he said. He'd be proud of how you handled yourself today. Hell, I'm proud of you and I barely know you. Thank you, I managed. For everything. For being there, for helping us, for recognizing what was right and acting on it, he smiled. That's just basic decency, Eleanor. The fact that it feels special says more about the world than it should. He tipped his hat, an old-fashioned gesture that somehow fit him perfectly, and left me alone with my inheritance and my grief. The next few months were surreal. Attorney Chang had been right about the legal defense fund. Jonathan did try to contest the will filing papers that questioned grandfather's competency, alleged undue influence, and painted me as a master manipulator who had stolen a fortune. But every claim evaporated under scrutiny. The psychiatric evaluations were unassailable. The recordings were legal and damning. The witness testimonies were consistent and credible. After 3 months of burning through his savings on legal fees, Jonathan's lawyer advised him to drop the case. He did, but not before sending me a final email that simply said, "I hope you choke on every dollar." I forwarded it to Attorney Chang without responding. She added it to the file of evidence documenting his harassment. Some battles I was learning are won by refusing to engage. My parents tried a different approach. They called tentatively at first, suggesting we work through this as a family. My mother even apologized, sort of saying she had been caught up in Jonathan's logic and hadn't meant to hurt anyone. But their concern for reconciliation seemed directly proportional to their realization that I now controlled resources they might someday need. When I politely declined to discuss finances or make any promises about future support, their calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I reopened the Golden Dawn Cafe 6 weeks after grandfather's funeral. I had spent those weeks deep cleaning, making minor repairs, and crying in the storage room when the grief became too heavy to carry standing up. Mrs. Sylvia and several other regulars helped me prepare refusing payment, insisting it was what neighbors did for each other. Agent Miller fixed the temperamental espresso machine, somehow coaxing it back to perfect function with nothing but patience and mechanical intuition. The reopening day was emotional. Customers came not just for coffee, but to share memories of grandfather, to tell me how he had impacted their lives in small but meaningful ways. He had given someone a job when they were desperate. He had let a struggling student study for hours over a single cup of coffee. He had remembered everyone's names, asked about their families, celebrated their victories, and mourned their losses. The cafe had been exactly what he intended, a warm spot in a cold world. I served coffee that day wearing Grandma Ruth's old apron, the one with hand-embroidered flowers along the hem that she had made herself. Every transaction felt like honoring them both, continuing what they had started decades ago. And for the first time since grandfather died, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. Over the following year, I transformed myself from a grieving granddaughter playing barista into a legitimate businesswoman. I took courses in small business management and hospitality. I hired staff, training them not just in coffee preparation but in the philosophy of the cafe. Every customer matters, every interaction is an opportunity for kindness. Profit is important, but community is essential. I renovated the apartment above the cafe, turning it into a proper living space that honored grandfather's memory while becoming fully mine. And I learned about the extent of grandfather's and Grandma Ruth's financial acumen. The investment portfolio was staggering in its diversity and wisdom. Ruth had invested in tech companies before anyone called it Silicon Valley. She had bought real estate in neighborhoods that later gentrified. She had diversified internationally before it was common. And grandfather had maintained her strategy faithfully after her death, never touching the principal, letting decades of compound interest work its magic. I was wealthy. Not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. It was terrifying and empowering in equal measure. 14 months after grandfather's death, I received an unexpected letter from Caldwell Development Group, the same company that had offered $2 million for the cafe property before I inherited. But this letter wasn't an offer to buy. It was a threat. They wanted the entire block, they explained, for a mixed-use development project. The cafe was the final holdout. They had purchased every other property over the past 2 years. Without my lot, their project couldn't proceed. They offered an astronomical sum, $8 million for the cafe property alone. When I declined, citing the cafe's sentimental and community value, their next letter was less friendly. They outlined zoning challenges they could initiate, permit reviews, they could demand health inspections, they could trigger legal obstacles they could create. The message was clear: sell willingly, or we'll make your life hell until you have no choice. I was sitting in the cafe after closing, reading this threatening letter for the third time when Jonathan walked in. I hadn't seen him in over a year, not since the will reading. He looked different, thinner, tired, less polished. His suit was off the rack instead of tailored, and his confident swagger had been replaced with something more hesitant. "I know you don't want to see me," he said, stopping a few feet from my table. "But I need to talk to you. Not about the inheritance. About Caldwell." I gestured to the chair across from me, more from shock than invitation. He sat, and for a moment we just stared at each other, siblings and strangers all at once. "They came after me too," he said finally. "Different situation, but same tactics. A client of mine is being squeezed by them." I started digging into their methods, and he paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "They're dirty, Eleanor. Really dirty. Bribery, intimidation, falsified inspections. And they're coming after you because you're vulnerable. A woman alone, running a small business, no corporate backing. They think they can crush you." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely confused. He looked down at his hands. "Because I owe you. Because Dad was right about me and it's taken me this long to admit it. Because I destroyed our family for money I didn't even get and I can't fix that, but maybe I can do this one thing right. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase. These are documents I've collected on Caldwell's practices. Evidence of their tactics with other properties. Names of officials they've paid off. If you fight them, you need ammunition. This is a start. I took the folder, flipping through it carefully. The information was damning photocopies of suspicious permits, testimonies from other business owners who had been harassed, even bank records showing payments to city inspectors. Jonathan, if you're representing a client against them, isn't this privileged information? I'm not representing that client anymore, he said. I quit the firm. I couldn't keep doing what I was doing, being who I was being. Working 80-hour weeks to buy things I didn't need, stepping on people to climb a ladder I didn't even want to be on. He laughed bitterly. Turns out losing everything helps you figure out what actually matters. What are you doing now? I asked, still wary but curious despite myself. Legal aid. Helping people who can't afford fancy lawyers fight systems designed to crush them. The pay is awful, the hours are still brutal, but I actually sleep at night now. He met my eyes. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Eleanor. I don't deserve it. Dad's letter was right. I chose greed over love. I tried to steal from him while pretending to care about him. I treated you like garbage because you represented everything. I was too much of a coward to be authentic, sacrificing present. I'm sorry. Those words don't fix anything, but they're true. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to throw his apology back in his face, to list every hurt and humiliation he had caused. But another part, the part that had learned about grace from grandfather and forgiveness from grandma, Ruth's memory recognized genuine contrition when I heard it. Thank you, I said finally, for the information and for the apology. I don't know if we can ever be family again, Jonathan. Too much has broken. But maybe we don't have to be enemies. He nodded, accepting that boundary. That's more than I deserve. He stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Dad would be proud of what you've done with the cafe. And with your life, you're exactly who he hoped you'd become. After he left, I sat alone with the Caldwell documents and a strange mix of emotions. Could people really change? Could someone who had been so consumed by greed find their way back to decency? I didn't know, but I knew that I had a fight ahead of me, and refusing help out of pride would be stupid. The battle with Caldwell Development Group lasted 6 months. They followed through on their threats, surprise health inspections that found imaginary violations, permit challenges that questioned the cafe's right to operate, zoning reviews that suggested the property should be restricted to residential use only. Each attack cost me time, money, and energy to fight. But I had resources. They didn't expect grandfather's legal defense fund, Attorney Chang's expertise, and now Jonathan's evidence. More importantly, I had community. Mrs. Sylvia organized customers to attend city council meetings, speaking passionately about the cafe's role in the neighborhood. Agent Miller used his connections in local media to investigate Caldwell's practices, resulting in a damaging exposé about their intimidation tactics. Local business owners who had been similarly targeted banded together, forming a coalition against corporate bullying. Jonathan worked behind the scenes, using his legal expertise to challenge every permit violation, to document every suspicious inspection, to build a case not just of harassment but of systematic corruption. He worked for free, refusing payment, saying it was the least he could do. We weren't close, not like siblings should be, but we developed a working respect. He proved through actions, not words, that his change was real. The turning point came when a local news station agreed to do a feature story. They interviewed me, other business owners, customers who loved the cafe, and community members who saw Caldwell's development plans as cultural erasure. The story painted a clear picture. Small business owner honors grandparents' legacy while fighting corporate greed. It went viral locally, then regionally, then somehow nationally. Suddenly, Golden Dawn Cafe wasn't just a coffee shop. It was a symbol. Caldwell Development's CEO James Caldwell requested a private meeting. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, and expensively dressed, the kind of man used to getting his way through money and power. I agreed to meet him at the cafe after hours with Attorney Chang present. He didn't offer pleasantries. "You're costing me millions, Miss Morrison. This development has investors, timelines, contracts. Your little coffee shop is holding up a $100 million project." He pulled out a checkbook. "I'm authorized to offer you $12 million. Today. Right now. You walk away, we forget this unpleasantness, and everyone wins." $12 million. The number hung in the air. I thought about what it could buy: security, luxury, freedom from worry. I thought about how tired I was from fighting, how much easier life would be if I just took the money and moved on. Then I looked around the cafe. I saw the table where Sylvia sat every morning. I saw the corner where new mothers gathered for support and community. I saw Grandma Ruth's hand-painted tiles and Grandfather Arthur's carefully chosen furniture. I saw the photographs on the walls documenting decades of love and service. "Mr. Caldwell," I said slowly, "my grandmother once told my grandfather that you can't put a price on meaning. You can quantify property values and profit margins, but you can't calculate the worth of a place where people feel they belong. This cafe isn't holding up your development. Your greed is. You want this block because it completes your vision, maximizes your returns, feeds your ego. I need this cafe because it's where my grandparents' love lives, where community thrives, where I honor the people who taught me that some things matter more than money." His face darkened. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said firmly. "You made the mistake when you assumed everyone has a price. When you thought intimidation would work better than respect. When you forgot that community is stronger than capital." I stood up. "This meeting is over. Attorney Chang will see you out." He left furious, but 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. A woman in her 30s came into the cafe during the morning rush. She ordered a latte, sat at the counter, and when the crowd thinned, introduced herself as Sarah Caldwell, James Caldwell's daughter. "My father is a difficult man," she said carefully. "Brilliant, driven, but he sees the world as a series of transactions. Everything is business. Everyone has a price. It's made him very successful and very lonely." She stirred her coffee absently. "I've been following your story. The news coverage, the community support, your refusal to be bought. It reminded me of my mother. She died when I was 12. She was a teacher, believed in people and purpose over profit. Dad's been different since she passed. Harder. More focused on winning than on being good." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, genuinely meaning it. "But why are you telling me this?" She looked up and her eyes were sad but determined. "Because I own 40% of Caldwell Development, my mother's inheritance. I've been a silent partner because Dad always said business wasn't for me. But watching what he's doing to you, to this neighborhood, to the legacy my mother believed in, I can't be silent anymore." She pulled out a folder. "I'm proposing a compromise. We scale back the development, incorporate your cafe as a protected historical landmark, include affordable housing in the project, and commit to community input on all decisions. In exchange, you sell us the 3 adjacent lots you inherited from your grandfather." I hadn't realized she knew about those properties. But she was right. I owned more than just the cafe building. Grandfather's portfolio included several nearby lots that I had barely thought about. "Why would your father agree to this?" I asked skeptically. She smiled. "Because I'm threatening to sell my shares to a competitor if he doesn't. And because whether he admits it or not, this fight is costing him more than money. It's costing him reputation. The public relations nightmare you've created is making investors nervous." She leaned forward. "I can't promise he'll suddenly become a good person. But I can promise that this deal protects what matters to you while allowing a development that serves the community." I consulted with Attorney Chang, with Jonathan, with the Community Coalition. We negotiated for 3 weeks. The final agreement was unprecedented. Caldwell Development would build their project around the cafe, designating it as a historical landmark. 20% of the new development would be affordable housing. A community board would have approval power over design and business tenants. In exchange, I sold the adjacent lots for $8 million and agreed not to sue for harassment. James Caldwell signed the agreement with barely concealed resentment. But he signed. And 6 months later, as construction began on a project that would actually benefit the neighborhood instead of displacing it, he requested another private meeting. This time, he came alone and humble. "My daughter says I owe you an apology," he began awkwardly. "She's right. I'm not good at this, Miss Morrison. I've spent 40 years building things by bulldozing obstacles. Your grandfather understood something. I'm only starting to learn that the best things can't be built by force. They have to be grown with care." He pulled out a photograph of a young woman with kind eyes. "My wife, Margaret. She would have liked your grandparents. She would have been ashamed of what I tried to do to you." "Mr. Caldwell," I said gently, "it's not too late to build something she'd be proud of. This new development, if done right, can honor her memory and serve this community. That's a legacy worth having. He nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. Sarah says you're planning to expand the cafe. Open new locations. She thinks we should talk about partnership opportunities. Not to buy you out, he added quickly, seeing my expression. To support you. Invest in what you're building. With no strings, no control, just belief in your vision. It was surreal having my former enemy offer to become an ally. But I was learning that people could surprise you, that redemption was possible, that even the hardest hearts could soften when confronted with authentic purpose. 5 years after Grandfather Arthur's death, Golden Dawn Cafe had become a small chain, 4 locations across Seattle, each one maintaining the original's commitment to community over pure profit. I had hired managers who shared the philosophy-trained staff in the art of genuine hospitality and created a business model that proved you could be successful without being ruthless. The original cafe remained my home base. I still lived in the apartment above, still worked the morning shift most days, still knew the regulars by name. Mrs. Sylvia, now approaching 90, still arrived at 7:15 for her cappuccino. Agent Miller, officially retired from everything except his daily coffee and newspaper, still sat at his corner table. And new customers joined the community every day, drawn by word of mouth and the kind of authentic atmosphere that no corporate strategy could replicate. On the 5th anniversary of Grandfather's death, I organized a memorial celebration. The cafe was packed with people whose lives he had touched, customers, neighbors, business owners, even some of the mothers whose children had played in Grandma Ruth's toy corner years ago. Jonathan came, bringing his wife Maria, a kind-faced teacher who reminded me a little of how Mom used to be before money became her priority, and their 2-year-old daughter Ruth, named after our grandmother. He had changed profoundly over those 5 years. He worked full-time at a legal aid clinic, lived in a modest apartment, and spent his free time coaching youth soccer. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something quieter and more genuine. We weren't best friends. The wounds he had inflicted were too deep for that. But we had rebuilt something, a cautious respect, an acknowledgement of shared history, a willingness to be family on new terms. My parents came too, though. Our relationship remained strained and distant. They had struggled financially after retiring, discovering that the lifestyle they had built required more money than they had saved. I had quietly paid some medical bills when Dad's health declined, but I maintained firm boundaries about their involvement in my life. They had made their choices. I was making mine. James Caldwell arrived with Sarah carrying a large wrapped frame. When I opened it, I found a commissioned painting of the original Golden Dawn Cafe, based on photographs from the 1970s, when Grandma Ruth and Grandfather Arthur were young and in love, standing together behind the counter. The artist had captured something ineffable, not just their faces, but their spirit, the way they looked at each other, with complete trust and joy. For everything you taught me, James said simply, about what matters and what lasts. But the most meaningful moment came when I stood before the crowd to speak about Grandfather. I talked about his wisdom, his kindness, his refusal to let money corrupt his values. I shared stories that made people laugh and cry. And then I talked about the lesson he had taught me through his final gift. My grandfather left me a fortune, I said, but his real inheritance wasn't money. It was perspective. He showed me that wealth without wisdom is just numbers in an account. That success without integrity is just emptiness in expensive packaging. That family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when showing up is hard. I looked around at the faces gathered there, loyal customers, supportive neighbors, community members who had fought beside me. He taught me that the best revenge against people who only value money is to build something meaningful. To live richly in all the ways that actually matter. To turn pain into purpose and loss into legacy. I pulled out Grandfather's letter, now laminated, to preserve it, and read his final lines. The best revenge against people who only value money is to live a life rich in all the ways that actually matter. He was right, I continued, my voice steady despite the tears on my cheeks. I could have taken the inheritance and spent my life resenting my family, hoarding my wealth, proving I was better than them. But that would have made me just as small as they tried to make me feel. Instead, I built this. A business that serves, a community that cares, a legacy that would make my grandparents proud. That's not just revenge. That's resurrection. Taking everything they tried to destroy and turning it into something beautiful. The applause was thunderous. But what I remember most is Jonathan standing in the back with tears streaming down his face, nodding as if he finally truly understood what he had lost and why. After the celebration, as I was cleaning up, Jonathan approached with little Ruth toddling beside him. She wanted to give you something, he said, helping his daughter hand me a crayon drawing of what I assumed was supposed to be a coffee cup. It's beautiful, I told Ruth, kneeling to her level. Thank you, sweetheart. Uncle Eleanor makes good coffee, she announced proudly. Jonathan and Maria had decided not to correct her confusion about my gender, finding her mispronunciation endearing. Jonathan waited until Ruth ran back to Maria before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said. About building something meaningful. I want to create a foundation. The Arthur and Ruth Morrison Foundation, if you'll allow me to use their names. To help small family businesses fight back against corporate intimidation and predatory development. To give them the legal resources they need to protect what matters. He paused. I was hoping you'd serve on the board. Help guide it. Make sure it actually helps people instead of just being another feel-good charity that does nothing. I looked at my brother, this man who had once been my enemy, seeing the genuine desire for redemption in his eyes. On one condition, I said. Mom and Dad. They're getting older. They're struggling. We help them, but we do it our way. Not by throwing money at them, but by teaching them what grandfather tried to teach us. That family is about more than what you can extract from each other. He nodded slowly. I can agree to that. Though I'm not sure they'll listen. Maybe they won't, I admitted. But we'll have tried. We'll have offered them the same grace grandfather offered us, a chance to choose differently. What they do with that chance is up to them. Over the following year, the Arthur and Ruth Morrison Foundation became a reality. Jonathan ran it with the same intensity he had once applied to corporate law, but now directed toward helping instead of exploiting. They took on cases against predatory developers, helped family businesses navigate legal challenges, and created a network of support for entrepreneurs trying to build something meaningful in a world that often valued profit over purpose. My parents surprised me by showing up one day at the original cafe asking if they could volunteer. Not for money or recognition, but because they wanted to understand what I had built and why it mattered. It was awkward at first. My mother struggled with taking orders instead of giving them. My father had to learn to engage with customers instead of hiding behind silence. But gradually something shifted. They began to see the cafe not as the prison they had imagined it to be, but as the community center it actually was. They started to understand what grandfather and I had been protecting. Full reconciliation never came. Some wounds are too deep, some betrayals too fundamental. But we achieved something perhaps more valuable: honest acknowledgement. They admitted they had been wrong, driven by greed and misplaced priorities. I admitted I had judged them harshly, perhaps more harshly than necessary. We couldn't change the past, but we could stop letting it poison the present. Now, 7 years after that devastating family dinner where my brother first revealed his greed, I stand in a very different place. I'm 35 years old, owner of a successful business that employs 40 people across 4 locations. I'm financially secure in ways I never imagined possible. I've been featured in business magazines as an example of ethical entrepreneurship. I've spoken at conferences about building profit with purpose. But none of that matters as much as the small moments. Mrs. Sylvia's granddaughter now works at the cafe learning the family recipes and the philosophy of service. Agent Miller's great-nephew comes in for homework help, using the cafe's quiet corner the way generations of students have. The Young Mothers group still meets every Tuesday, now led by women who once came as struggling new moms and stayed to support the next generation. Jonathan and I have coffee together once a month at the original location. We talk about the foundation, about his cases, about little Ruth's hilarious observations about the world. We don't talk much about the past. We don't need to. The fact that we're here together voluntarily choosing relationship says everything that needs to be said about redemption and growth. Sarah Caldwell has become a genuine friend. She transformed her father's company from the inside, pushing for community-centered development that her mother would have been proud of. James himself, now in his 70s, sits on the board of Jonathan's foundation, using his business acumen to help instead of harm. He told me once, late one night over coffee, that fighting me was the best thing that ever happened to him because losing forced him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about success. As I lock up the cafe tonight, the same ritual grandfather performed thousands of times, I think about his letter and his wisdom. He was right about everything. The money mattered less than I feared and more than I expected. It gave me options, security, the ability to build and protect and serve. But it didn't define me. The choices I made defined me. The community I nurtured defined me. The legacy I built on top of his and Grandma Ruth's legacy defined me. Family isn't just blood. It's choice. It's showing up. It's loving people even when they make it hard, but also protecting yourself when that love becomes self-destruction. Jonathan chose to change to become someone worth reconciling with. My parents chose eventually to acknowledge their mistakes. But even if they hadn't, I would have been okay. I had built a family of choice around me, customers who became friends, neighbors who became community strangers, who became witnesses to a different way of living. The greatest revenge against people who tried to make me feel small was becoming large. Not in ego or arrogance, but in purpose and impact. They tried to reduce me to a servant, a disappointment, an obstacle to their greed. I responded by building something that serves thousands, that employed dozens, that proved their values were bankrupt, while mine were invaluable. Every morning when I open the cafe and turn on the lights, I see Grandma Ruth's tiles and Grandfather Arthur's furniture and the photographs documenting their love story. I see the community they started and I continued. I see the golden dawn they named this place, for that moment when darkness surrenders to light, when hope defeats despair, when love proves stronger than greed. That's what I learned from my grandparents' final gift. That dignity can't be bought, but it also can't be stolen. That integrity costs everything and nothing simultaneously. That the best way to honor people who loved you is to live in a way that would make them proud. That sometimes the family you're born with isn't the family you need, and that's okay, because real family finds you when you live authentically. I inherited $8 million and a coffee shop. But what I really inherited was a choice: become bitter or become better. I chose better. I chose to transform pain into purpose, betrayal into boundaries, loss into legacy. I chose to build instead of destroy, to include instead of exclude, to forgive without forgetting, to move forward without looking back. Was it revenge? Maybe. The sweetest kind. The kind where you win not by making your enemies lose, but by building something so meaningful that their attempts to diminish you become irrelevant. The kind where you prove through the life you build and the people you serve and the community you create that they were wrong about everything that matters. My grandfather called me his golden dawn, the light after his darkest night. But he was mine too. He gave me permission to be strong when I thought strength meant endurance. He showed me that real power isn't the ability to control others, but the courage to control yourself, to set boundaries, to choose your path even when everyone else insists you're wrong. So here's what I want you to understand: whoever you are listening to this story, you don't have to accept the role your family assigns you. You don't have to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You don't have to choose between loving people and protecting yourself. You can set boundaries and still be kind. You can walk away from toxicity and still wish people well. You can inherit a fortune or inherit nothing. What matters is what you build with what you're given. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's resurrection. Taking everything they tried to destroy in you and using it to create something beautiful. That's what my grandparents taught me. That's what I hope I'm teaching others. That's the legacy worth leaving. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt undervalued or manipulated or trapped in a family dynamic that made you doubt your worth, I want you to know something. You're not alone. Your struggle is valid. Your decision to protect yourself is not selfish, it's necessary. And on the other side of that hard choice, there's a life waiting that you can't even imagine yet. A life where you define your value, where you choose your family, where you build your legacy. So tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation? What did you learn from that choice? How did you find the courage to set boundaries or walk away? And if you're still in that dark place, still deciding whether you deserve better, let this story be your permission. You do. You absolutely do. Like this video if my story helped you see your own situation more clearly. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who chose themselves without apology. Comment and share your own story, because every voice matters, every experience counts, and together we create a community that proves love doesn't have to hurt, and family doesn't have to be toxicity disguised as tradition. Remember, dawn always comes. Sometimes it takes longer than you'd like. Sometimes you have to fight through the darkest night to see it. But it comes. And when it does, it's golden.